Hey, everybody. It is I, Hope Giselle, and I am back at you all with another imperative talk about HIV. Yes, you guessed it. Me and my friends over at the HIV Vaccine Trial Network are coming up with a bunch of amazing ways to inform you about the topic of HIV, and especially during Women's History Month, the topic of HIV and women. But because of my place in community, you know I got to keep it black, y'all. So I have two amazing women that are in the community doing this work, and we're going to have a discussion to decide and to tell you all the best practices around HIV, how we feel about it, what's coming up about it, what is the most pressing issue that Black women are facing as it pertains to this topic. We're going to do so in a way that feels real and authentic to us. So, if you are ready to have a real conversation with real Black women about HIV, your health, and the best way to preserve it, then stick around with us. Today, I have two amazing guests, Miss Tony and Miss Sadie, but they'll tell you a little bit more about how they do their jobs and what exactly their job is. Hey, y'all.
Hey, hey. Hi, humans.
So,
How are y'all?
right. Hi,
Right.
humans. Hi, everybody in the human race. So, first and foremost, I want to thank you, ladies, for joining me. I really appreciate the fact that y'all took time out of the schedule that y'all are doing. I know, Tony, you filming and working and doing all of the things. And I know, Sadie, y'all have 1,001 initiatives going on at your org. So, it just means a lot that y'all took the time to have this conversation with me today. And I want to give the floor for you all to explain, like, what you do in the movement and why who you are is imperative to this conversation. I guess we can start with you, Sadie.
So, hi, everybody. Hello. So I, from 9 to 5, what gives me a check, right?
Come
What
on.
gives me a check is I work for AIDS United, which is a national HIV organization that focuses on policy and advocacy specifically. So I'm their state policy manager. And then outside of that, I do a plethora of other things. So I'm an advocate every day, all day. I'm in several different coalition spaces in the lovely city of Dallas, Texas. I am co-founder of the First Reproductive Black March here in Dallas. And then I'm on the board of directors for a reproductive justice organization. So we out here busy. We busy.
Busy. Okay. Go ahead, Tony.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Tony Bryce. I am an actress. That's my bread butter, my passion, if you will. But beyond that, I do a couple of things. I am a PrEP ambassador for Black Women's Health Imperative, the campaign known as I Am HIV Possible. And then I'm also a community captain for ViV Healthcare's initiative called Risk to Reasons here in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, but I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, but I live in Atlanta, Georgia. But the work that I do mainly is in Atlanta, but as of recently has been allowing me to travel and go to other cities, to preach the good word about HIV prevention and PrEP.
Look here. I first and foremost, I love the idea that one, as it pertains to the work that we're doing, we get to do it in so many different places. So, for those of you all who may or may not know, my name is Hope Giselle. I am the new CEO and executive director of the National Trans Visibility March, on top of a bunch of other different things, child. Just like Tony, just like Sadie, on my off time and my 9 to 5, I'm a communications director. Lord Jesus, I work with the National Black Justice Coalition for a couple of other things. I'm a journalist and featured journalist for Elle Blavity. You've seen my work in a couple of different other spaces, Ebony, Essence, and just I'm around here. And I think that a large part of my advocacy would not take place without Black women and would not take place without the works of Black women, which is the reason why I think that when I wanted to have this conversation around HIV and health and just talking through like what it means to speak through these things for Women's History Month, I wanted to make sure that the conversation that I was having was for and geared towards other Black women like myself. And I think that we can't talk about HIV without talking about sex, everybody, right? We got to have the sex talk, okay? And as Megan Thee Stallion once said in one of her famous songs, like, let's have a sex talk, yeah, right? Like, and I think that when we talk about sex and when we talk about sex, especially specifically within the Black community, and we mention HIV amongst Black women, one of the first things that we have to hear about is sexuality. And we also have to hear about the idea of where the stigma comes around or comes from, which is usually the idea or the ideation that Black queer people have brought this in, which have like tripled the numbers for Black cishet women. And I think that while we know that those numbers don't lie, the socialization of that rumor is something that is really harmful. And I want to kind of open the conversation of just kicking the door down on that and ask you ladies, like, how do y'all feel about that? Like, do y'all, one, like, do you agree with that stigma? Do you think that it's tired? Do you think that it's time that we retire that? Or do you believe that there just needs to be more education so that folks don't continue to perpetuate that?
So I'm kind of conflicted, because so I come from a very religious background. So, like, within the Black culture, my experience was similar to being bad and good. But I came out later in life. So I identify as pansexual, but I prefer women. So I think that, like, it just wasn't talked about enough. And so I don't necessarily know if it's just education that needs to be uplifted, but I think it needs to be celebrated as far as pleasure, not necessarily sex. Pleasure is something that is not talked about in our culture and just with our people. It's not uplifted in that at all. It's very much like abstinence only. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do nothing, instead of just allowing you to figure out who you are and figure out what makes good to you. Because at one point I thought I liked men, and then I was like, man, I don't really know if I like that. And then I'm like, I don't know what I like. I don't know what I need to be, but I didn't figure that out. So I was like 30 years old. So I think it's a combination of both. I think it's also tired, but I think a lot of it also has to do with combating misinformation and changing narrative and conversations too.
I have a lot of thoughts around this. I'm going to try to put them all together. So, this past weekend, like I mentioned earlier, I am a PrEP ambassador for Black Women's Health Imperative I Am HIV Possible campaign. And when I went to St. Louis and then I went to Nashville. And part of that experience was the Black women who came to the Raheem Devon and Lettucey concert. They had to come in line and they had to talk to me about the campaign briefly, and then they also had to take a survey. And on that survey, there was a statistic that said over 50% of women who are newly diagnosed are Black women. And I felt like when they read that, a lot of them went like, oh. And then it kind of made them think like, I just recently saw something on the news, or, I had a friend or a family member. And I was talking to somebody as well about why are we not having these conversations in the Black community? And a lot of times I do think it stems from like just a religious upbringing and background. And I'm like, well, suffering in silence is possibly why these numbers keep increasing, because there's nobody having the conversation. There are HIV possible and positive people everywhere, in the pulpit, in school, here, in our friend groups, in our families. Even as of recently here in Atlanta, when it comes to ballroom, I'm a legendary house mother in Kiki Ballroom, and what I think, even when these Black queer and trans students are coming to Atlanta and they're attending these HBCUs, it's a whole new world for them. And they've been so sheltered in the sense of not receiving that education and information that when they come, they're experiencing sex, they're experiencing what STIs are via information or lived experience and having to go get tested and treatment. And so they're experiencing what does a full panel of an STI test is, and it's not just HIV, gonorrhea, chlamydia, and syphilis. There's other things to be talked about and to test for. So I just have so many thoughts around this, and I just think it really boils down to Black families are not having a conversation, especially Black women who are identifying as cishet, because I think they just don't think they're part of the demographics that HIV is impacting. So.
I mean, yeah, I'll kind of piggyback off of that a little bit. Like I lived in a rural area right outside of Texas, so we didn't have opportunities to go look for certain things. So, like, the idea of what you're saying is like you come into college and you get in a whole new experience, and no one's telling you what a STI panel looks like. Yeah, that's accurate. Like, I had to go to Planned Parenthood, and Planned Parenthood, the doctor didn't look like me. So
Yeah.
I didn't think I really needed to know like anything about that. I was like, oh, I'm only messing with this one person, so
Mhm.
nothing's going to happen because it's that one person. So yeah, you're not knowing any of those things. No one's ever bringing up anything to you. It's like a whole new world, and
Yeah.
nothing's being celebrated to you. It's just being told you can't do this or you can't do that, and that's it.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think
Right.
that to that frame, like a lot of, especially when you're in the Black household, it's like guys and boys and masculine of center people. And I say that because in my story, I got I had the sex talk twice, right? And I'm not sure if that's true for you, Tony, but I had two different conversations. When I was being socialized as a young boy, and let's be very clear, my mama always knew that I was queer of some sort, right?
Mhm.
I also identify as pansexual. So I did have a girlfriend, a very long standing girlfriend. And I think that my mama hoped to Jesus that that would like end up being my life partner. But unfortunately, she's no longer with us. And it was one of those things that when I was having the sex talk about that and the possibility behind that, it was, oh, if you want to do this and if you want to have sex, like you come home and we talk about that because ain't no man finna run my baby down the street butt naked. Like they're hurting young boys for having sex, and that's just a natural part of life. Like I remember my mom checking my auntie because she caught one of my cousins masturbating and she beat him, and she was just like, no, you're gonna traumatize that boy and all of those things. But then like literally a couple of months later, my mom didn't even catch me, but she realized that I was watching porn, and I was grounded for a year. I shit you not, an entire year I
I
was
got
grounded.
you.
And it wasn't because I was watching porn, because that was natural, right? It was because I was watching the men, and she understood that my attraction to the porn had nothing to do with the big booty women and all of those different things. And so what I also recognized and realized was that once I transitioned and me and my mom's relationship got stronger, and we kind of sort of strengthened our bond, there was this entirely different conversation about sex. And there was this entirely different conversation about HIV, and the fact that like now as a woman and as a young lady, I needed to be on the lookout for these men who weren't going to be honest, and for these men who weren't going to do X, Y, and Z. And I needed to be poised about it, and I needed to be more selective about it, and I needed to choose my sex partners carefully. But when we were having this conversation, when I was, just a young man, whether I was a butch queen and I was, expressing my interest towards men, or whether I was talking about this one young lady that I liked, there wasn't as much caution around it, right? Like there wasn't so much like need to tell me to be selective around that. And I think that as it pertains to this conversation, especially amongst Black women, we are often told, and I thank you so much for centering that, Sadie, that pleasure, right, is reserved for the male and the masculine species, and the masculine representation. We are there to be in fear for our lives, to be in fear for our bodies, and then in the event that you find somebody that you trust, it is your job to then only and specifically, right, like hold on to that person for as long as you can hold on to them for. But they don't tell us that you're having sex with that person and whoever that person is having sex with, right? They don't
Exactly.
tell us that pleasure is also important. And so if you're gonna lay down, it's not just about the contraction of HIV, and the things that follow it. It's also about like, is he pleasing you, right? Are you going through this and are you in all of this fear of catching something for at least something that's worthy of your time and energy because you're feeling pleasure by it? Or are you just doing what you feel like you have to do because we've been conditioned to believe that men want sex and it's our job to give it to them?
Mhm. I know for me, Hope, I I don't recall really having those conversations with my mother. Definitely not, the sperm donor. But with my mother, I don't recall having those particular conversations. More than anything, and like when I started to transition, me and my mom, our relationship got so much better. But if anything, I was just kind of like and demonize, antagonize, all these kind of things about who they assumed me to be at that time. But what I will say is I got some education in school, and that was both middle school and in high school. I remember we had a sex ed class, and I remember, I don't remember which, but in one, um, so the assignment was every student had to take a STI, and they had to present it. They had to do a presentation on it in sex ed class. And I remember one of them. Now I don't know why. I don't know if it was just STIs or if it was identity. That part I'm not clear about. But I remember one, in either high school or middle school, I did ambiguous genitalia, which would translate as intersex. And then I did pubic lice and the other one. And so I learned early on about STIs, not even necessarily at home, but in school. And so I thank God for that experience, because I learned, I guess that seed had been planted early on what STIs are, but it wouldn't take until I was really in college where I really dove into the work of HIV prevention and really learning about STIs and how to contract and transmit, how to treat, and how to prevent. And so I would really give credit to college and starting at work in college around 2010.
I want to ask because there was something that was really interesting that you brought up that kind of leads us
Mhm.
into the second section, Sadie, where you said that you went to Planned Parenthood and your doctor didn't look like you, right? And that leads me into Black bodies and white comfort, right? Like, and what does that look like for us? And especially, what does that look like for us as femme presenting people and women going into a healthcare field that essentially, and what a lot of Black women would feel like is rigged against us, right? The healthcare is not the same. We don't get the same quality of patients around our pain. We don't get the same quality of pain management when it comes down to the idea of how they deal with us when we go into the office and make certain claims and say that certain things are wrong with us. And then especially as it pertains to I think being Black women and going in and saying that we want to, get an STI or an STD testing, or we want that full panel analysis. There is sometimes, and I'm not sure if this is true for you all, but trans or not, I have been a trans woman and watched as people, I think even aesthetically, like aesthetics play into it, right? Because as a trans woman who a lot of people would say is respectable, I've gone in and asked for a test. And while there was like a pause around it, because there was like this idea of me saying like, oh, I don't have a period, that doesn't apply to me, right? There wasn't this like ultimate look of disgust about who I was or who I could be. And then I would watch another young Black woman who I would assume to be cis come in, but because of her appearance, there was judgment about how she might or why she might have been coming in to get her test. And I think that there's this need for us as Black people then to turn around and say like, oh, like I ain't no hoe, like, and that's a real scenario that I ran through as I was in a Planned Parenthood, right, waiting to get my screening. And the young lady felt the need because she saw the same thing that I saw, but on a different level, from the person that was checking her in and from the nurses that were there, where she felt like she had to say like, I ain't no hoe, like I come in every year, and it's just like, why do we have to justify why we are here to check on our health in order to make you feel comfortable as a white person dealing with me, so that your judgment doesn't affect me while I'm sitting in this space? And so, have you all had those issues when like going in to be tested, or even in the work that y'all do? Like, I know like, AIDS United, y'all do a lot of different work and outreach with different people. I know, Tony, like you having to deal with Beeve and like, all these different campaigns, you run across a lot of different races of people. And I just want, like, do the microaggressions of race sometime impact your work?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think like so the first time I tried to access prep twice. I've been on prep two different times. And once I did have the first time I ever got tested, ever got an HIV test, ever got an STI panel, all of that, I went to a white centered HIV clinic, and the whole entire, like everything from the MA to the folks who tested me, were white. There wasn't anybody that looked like me. So because I already kind of knew what prep was a little bit, I had intentions like this is going to be easy. These folks also know me. I also was in the community doing advocacy work. So I was like assuring that everything would be fine. But I think a lot of it had to do with these folks no longer looked at me as like the Sadie that they know from the community. They looked at me like, oh, why are you in here? I didn't know that you have it. So you felt like you had to answer questions outside the box. Like the person that tested me the first time, they didn't even know really what questions to ask me. They were like, well, are you having anal sex? And I'm like, no, not right now. But is that necessary? They're like, oh, well, I don't really test women, so I have no idea. So I had to test myself. Just so happened I knew how to take a test that I could test myself. But it's just those things. And then having a doctor who was a white cis man tell me, like, well, what's the reasons why you need it? Where have you heard this before? What makes you feel like you're a great candidate for it? So now you've given the third degree as to why you need it. Long story short, trying to access prep the second time and being discouraged again, it was a Black woman that I went to get prep. And I was even, had microaggressions that happened to me on that, because I'm thinking like, this is going to be easy. She's a Black woman. She's going to understand me. And it was more of like, no longer about the fact that I'm a woman getting prep. It was like, well, so you're out here in these streets, so you need prep. And I'm like, no. And so now I feel like I'm in the office talking to her, and her facial expressions, her dynamics, the questions that she's asking me to probe me is like, now, oh, well, so how many partners do you have? And I'm like, so at that point, I'm like, I'm about to lie, because you're not about to embarrass me by myself to be able to end. And, you just feel discouraged afterward, that I don't even remember taking it maybe like more than 2 months after that. I was like, no, I'm not going back to her again for no follow-up, because this is the second time. Maybe I'm not meant to take prep. Maybe I'm biting more off I can chew. You made the conversation about, and also in other spaces, I've been doing this work for 6 years, and it is very hard. Because I was in white spaces. I never felt seen until I worked at my current job that I'm in now, because I see Black women of all experiences, whether queer or cis or straight, whatever. I see them in leadership. I see them doing work that I feel valid, but I always haven't had that. I feel like I had to work harder, one, to prove that I was capable of doing this work, but also that I had a voice. And I was like, where is the dog in the fight for me on this? Where am I being seen? Where am I being canted? And so that made me have to work even harder and infiltrate spaces that I realized, like, up until last year, I was like, look, I am not about to be in harmful spaces. Let me just move around for what I'm doing. And the dynamics of my job had changed to where I was like, I'm no longer feeling like I need to be in every single space to make sure that I'm included. You either like me or you don't, and that's it. And so, yeah, the dynamics have changed. It is hard when you're in a white world trying to prove, because Black women, but then they depend on us when it's time for things to get done. They're like, we'll just depend on the Black woman to do it, because we always get it done.
Come on.
We always get it done. We always make sure it's handled, and we shouldn't have to. There was the idea of being, resilience. I don't really necessarily resonate with that, because I'm like, Black folks are tired. Black women are exhausted, if that makes sense. We're exhausted. We're exhausted from taking care of everybody and also advocating for ourselves.
Honestly, I haven't had experiences with white bodies in spaces that I'm seeking out care. When I first, I mean, I guess I did when I was in college with the community-based organization. There were white people that worked there, but my connect and the sole person I worked with was a Black person. So I worked around them, but I didn't necessarily work directly with them. But what I will say is, whenever I came to Atlanta and I started I had already started my transition, but I really say when I started to flourish in my transition, I was in community spaces, and when it came to prep, it was always Black people. When it came to the community-based organizations, it was always Black people. When I started HRT, it was a Black woman. So yeah, it's always been Black people. But what I will say about the spaces is, it was hard to find spaces where people like me were in those spaces. And I remember one of the first times that when I was a community health outreach worker here in Atlanta, and I remember, younger trans folks, the girls particularly, would come in and they would see me, they would feel that sense of like community and connection already, because, oh, it's another trans person here. And so we would be able to have conversations that they wouldn't be able to have with the staff that were not trans. And so I know how that felt from a person providing care. but I also know what it felt like as a person seeking care to not see people like me in those spaces. But what my hope is with the campaigns such as I Am HIV Possible and the Risk to Reasons, is that we have been traveling and having conversations with medical providers and having these type of honest conversations about what our experiences have been. So what I do is I take experiences of my own and then my friends or people that I know who has had these type of experiences and just kind of tell those stories. Um, we were just in Newport Beach, California. We were at a family planning medical uh, meeting that they called it, and so it was a lot of healthcare providers, and we just had an honest conversation about what does certain things look like whenever a person goes to visit. It was even for me down to the thing whenever we talk about my preferred pronoun. My pronouns are not preferred; they're
They're
required.
mandatory.
Yeah, they're mandatory. They're not preferred because I don't
But,
prefer you calling me her. I require you. And
but,
if you're not doing that, then this is not the space for me. I don't want you to think that my existence is preferred or it's optional for you to do something. No. So like having those, even those type of conversations around pronouns and care all the way up to just the interactions and the language that's being used. So that's my hope, is that these type of campaigns and initiatives that I've been a part of will hopefully help better everyone's experience as we move forward, because we know in the past it hasn't been great at all.
I think that to the point that both of you all are making, I've been on both of those ends where I've gone into a doctor's office and everybody has been white. And I've also gone into doctor's offices and not seen myself. I remember when I first moved to DC, I went to the doctor's office and I believe I just had like a it was a migraine from the pits of hell, y'all. And I don't get headaches. I'm not a migraine person. Like some people just like it happens to them often, or like every once in a blue moon. But I don't get them. So when I do get a headache or a migraine, I know it's something wrong with me. And this particular migraine was like just everlasting, so bad that it woke me out of my sleep at 1 a.m. And even though I had to be to work at 7 to open my store, I was like, you know what? I'm going to the emergency room because this just hurts too crazy. And it's 1 a.m. I have to Uber. I really ain't got the money to be Ubering, but I don't have no other way to get there. I get there. I'm frustrated. I'm aggravated. I still got a headache. And I get to the back, and the nurse does not realize that I'm a trans woman. And so, what I realized and what I noticed was that at the beginning of our conversation, we're having this conversation about all the possibilities of the things that it could be. Right. And it's just like, oh, girl, da 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 da. And then, of course, they come down to the PMS. Right. And it's just like, and like, sometimes it just is real bad on your period, girl. And I'm just like, well, that's not possible for me because I'm trans. Like, so I doubt that it's my period. Thinking that we were going to continue this same banter that we had continued before I said that. The conversation completely shifted. And it wasn't that she treated me like a pariah, but it was that all of her unconscious biases about trans people came out. And it was just like, oh. And then the sexual question started. And then it was, how many partners do you have? And how many people are you having sex with? And da 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 da. And very much so, like you said, Sadie, it was one of those things where I didn't even feel the need to have to lie, because at that point I was dry, child. It was giving no partners. It was giving nothing. It was giving very much so cough mothballs over here. And so I didn't have to like make up numbers, but I could tell that it didn't matter what I said. She wasn't going to believe me. And that at this point that she also was under the assumption that I was a sex worker just because I was trans and for no other reason. Like, I'm giving you the answers to your questions. I'm telling you that I haven't been sexually active. I'm telling you, like, all of these things that you are now asking me don't apply to me, but my head is still killing me. And the only thing that you can do is bring yourself to get me a full panel STD and STI test, which I thank you for. Cool. I always want to know my status because knowing is sexy, but that's not what I asked you for. And come to find out, when I went to, an affirming clinic, Whitman Walker, and I got a chance to sit down with my now PCP, she was like, oh, girl, you dehydrated. Like, your numbers came back for X, Y, and Z. And yeah, no wonder you got a headache because you ain't drinking no water. What is going wrong with you, Hope? Like, you cannot live off of ice mochas and maca lattes all day. Like, that's not how that works. And I just thought about the idea that my care was put in jeopardy because of somebody's bias, because they did not understand me as a
Yeah.
person. And then in the reverse, like having, you know, white doctors, especially now that I've had bottom surgery, having white doctors who don't know how to deal with the neo vagina see something off and feel like, oh, like there must be something going on, and it's just like, lady, I've been having sex with the same person for the last 5 years and I'm married. Like all of these things that you're trying to like put onto me are not my thing. I am free and open and all of the sexual things, but we not there in my marriage right now. So love, stop it. Like if you don't know what's going on, feel free to tell me that you don't know what's going on and send me back to my surgeon. But don't make up things and don't put me in a position where now I have to question and second guess myself and my sense of morality because you simply don't want to admit that you are not used to dealing with this situation. And I think oftentimes as Black women, and especially as it pertains to HIV and sexual health, we are always lumped into this idea that we have to be doing something wrong, that something is amiss, that we're allowing ourselves to be a part of some debauchery. And that's the reason why we're here. And it's just like, but when white women come in here and she done had sex with the whole block, that's the last question that y'all ever asked when it should have been the first one, you know? And it's just like, where do we like how does the work evolve so that Black women can go into the office and one, feel safe no matter who and what color the doctor is? Because like you just said, Sadie, and like we've all kind of sort of had those experiences, that sometimes it don't matter that they're Black. It matters about the nuances of where they come from, who they are, what they believe, religious beliefs, social understanding, all of those things. And then sometimes when they are not Black, they don't understand the dichotomy of leaving your racism at home and leaving your microaggressions at the door, right? And so I think that like my next question is, what does the work look like? I know that all of us in our respective places are doing things and we're all, you know, like moving and shaking in this space. But what does the real work look like for us? And especially as it pertains to Black women and making sure that we feel safe in environments, specifically talking around our sexual health and HIV. And what are some of the things that like we want these people and these healthcare folks and physicians to know?
You know, I think that like, well, it's multifaceted. It's so many other things along the lines. But one thing that I can say is like, we always say that we need to like have conversations, but no, we need accountability now. I think
Yeah.
we are past the pace of we just need to have conversations. It's now about like, hey, I done talked to you about this before. Why you not doing it? This goes for provider spaces. This goes from not just the doctors, but the MAs, the people that work the front desk, the folks that are cleaning the bathroom. These are folks that need these accountability conversations because what they do really depends on how the provider moves and shakes. If I had had a great experience with the MA, with the person who was doing the testing, with the person that was taking my blood pressure, with the person that was making me fill out my forms, I would have been really at a better place with the provider because now they have set the tone of what the provider is going to be like. Well, if the provider is great and all these people are terrible, by the time I get to the provider, I'm like exhausted mentally, emotionally, and everything. And so I think that the work looks like now is no longer just providing you a conversation and I'm having, because those conversations are turning to me educating you again after I educated you like 5 times. Now it's time for accountability. You know, I do most of my work is policy and advocacy, but I see now in those spaces that it's like we don't talk to the same folks for the last 15 years because folks are not out of office, right? About how we need them to take care of folks who are living with and vulnerable to HIV. But now we need to talk to them about accountability. You told me 10 years ago that you were going to prioritize the needs of humans, and you haven't done that yet. So what's happening here? Are you just playing games with me or, you know, what's happening? And I think that like, we just have to start doing that and also prioritizing being intentional about our work too, because we're not even doing that. You know, we just put everyone in the space because they decide to be in the space, you know, like you were talking before about, you know, folks are going in and having conversations with providers and educating them. You know, I don't want to be picked just because I'm a Black woman. I want to be picked because I can provide you education or I can talk to you about having conversations that are honest and real. Don't pick me because of what I look like on the outside. I want you to see that, but I don't want you to pick me just because of that. And maybe that's me, but I'm ranting. But that's those are two things I think that makes the work look different than what has been done before.
Facts.
Honestly, I agree. I do think we tend to lean on, oh, we need to have more conversation, we need to have more education. But it really is about accountability because conversations are being had. Education is out there, but are you holding yourself accountable to know that the things that you're learning that you're actually applying? Some of these conversations I was having in St. Louis, I remember there was a woman. She was like, "Yeah, I seen this on the news." Okay, wonderful. So you seen it on the news, but are you bringing it to your friend group? Are you talking about it beyond what you saw on the news, or did you see it and just keep going about life? I remember there was a lady. She was like, "Oh, child, I've been married for 27 years." Okay, girl, marriage is not a prevention method, my love. So are you holding yourself accountable to know that I am aware that these things are happening in the world and what am I doing? What am I doing about it? Because we as people, clearly as Black people, as Black women, can't just depend on the medical system to have our best interest at heart. Like we have to have our own best interest at heart. So I think you hit that right on the nail about accountability. And I feel like moving forward, that's something that I can speak about is accountability versus just education, information. Because we want education and information and conversation ourselves to death, and we are doing it, and we are still having to do it. Okay.
We can't be put in like, it's that whole idea is like we are not responsible having the world make us responsible to be educated. We are evolved as humans all throughout the age. One minute you might like this, the next minute you like something. Like I have done testing in the community for years, and I have folks who are like, oh, I've been married for like 15 years. Okay, but that marriage could be gone in tomorrow, and now you talking to somebody completely different. Your sexual behaviors have changed, and I wouldn't really say behaviors, but your sexual preferences have changed. Your pleasure seeking is completely different, and now you're having sex in a different way that you didn't have before, and you've been spending your time only thinking this way, and now it's something different. We evolve as people, so it's no longer like your learning is never over with. I don't care if you get 70 years old. 70-year-old women are still having sex. So
Yeah.
you're gonna be your idea of pleasure and sex and all of those things in your health is gonna change. You're gonna learn things just like we go through a workout routine every year because we're trying to get fine. That's the same way we need to do about everything else.
I last year on World AIDS Day, I was at an event and I was on a panel. And I had said, I talked about marriage not being a prevention method. And I went on to say, heterosexuality is not a prevention method. A monogamous relationship is not a prevention method. He got kids is not a prevention method. And I feel like sometimes you have to dumb it down to the very basics of life to talk about like, girl, and that is wonderful. But those are not prevention methods. Let's talk about actual prevention methods. Let's talk about condom uses. Let's talk about getting tested regularly. Let's talk about PrEP. I know a lot of people don't, want to be abstinent, and that's okay, baby. Pleasure is a thing, and it's important. Okay, as you said earlier, that's what Risk to Reasons is about. It's about centering pleasure at the end of the day. Moving from our risk of being HIV vulnerable to like what are the reasons? How are we pleasuring ourselves, but also knowing that how we enjoying pleasure, but also being aware that we have to be HIV or prevention, talking about HIV prevention, but also pleasure. So yeah, I had to just like dumb it down to those like, and the people was like, yes, because these are not prevention methods. These are not prevention methods. Because there was even a lady that said, she was like, oh, HIV is still around? Mind you, she didn't even say HIV. She said AIDS is still around. I said, well, hold on, because those are two different conversations. HIV and AIDS are different. Although one can progress to the other, there's still different conversations. Right now, we're talking about HIV. But she said AIDS, and obviously, if you grew up in that, the epidemic, then, that was obviously the big headlines: AIDS versus AIDS and or HIV. But yeah, she said AIDS is still around, and I was like, okay, all right. So clearly, you don't think think you're a part of the conversation. Clearly, you don't think you're a part of the demographics that's being impacted by HIV. Clearly, you think you are immune. And like again, the first letter in HIV is H, which stands for human. Like, baby, we're all human. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't have a preference. There's no preferred body that it chooses. It's for human. It's all of us that are impacted. And I say if you are not a person living with HIV, then you are HIV possible. And it's really that simple. It's really that simple.
Experiences don't happen until experiences happen.
Until
You can
Yeah.
look here.
look, you can go one part of your life and your season be this season, your other part be the next season. You don't know what it's gonna look like. Like I'm about to get married, so I was telling people they're like, oh, you're gonna be with them forever. I'm like, that's great, right? I hope to be with them forever, but you be with a person for a season, and you hope that that season lasts as long as it can last, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's the same way that you look about your health. And so I think a lot of times too, like people, like you were saying, they think like I've been doing this the same way my whole entire life, so I'm exempt. Nothing's gonna ever happen to me. The possibility of it is not. Yes, I'm marrying a woman right now, right, or a woman presenting person right now, but that doesn't mean that I might not forever. I could be 7 years old and meet a man or make something different, and then now I'm in a wholly new world. But because I've been like this forever, now I can't go outside of the process of it. And I think just like, yeah, having conversations of it and making sure that those conversations are accountable with interconnections, because we got folks that saying the same thing what you said, like, oh, we are HIV still exists, or they'll say, oh, well, I didn't know that this happened. And you be sitting there thinking, like, didn't I know you watch the news? I
Right.
know that like Google is free. What you mean you didn't know that these situations happen? And I'm like, okay, maybe it's just that's when my head automatically makes me think is like those conversations about accountability has to happen
Mhm.
within our own community, the folks who do this work every day, but then also the folks that are outside. You were bringing up a conversation about like, what are you saying in your spaces? I have lots of people in my spaces that, didn't get more understanding until they were around me and seeing the work that I did. And a lot of times I'll ask them, like, what are you doing though in your spaces that I'm not in? Like, you have a great conversation with me, but when I'm gone, are you having that same conversation with someone else? And they're like, well, no, I ain't really doing that because that person don't like it. I'm like, well, what if they don't? What if they don't like it? They're gonna have to figure it out some way. And so, like, transforming those conversations to make them interconnected, because we have legislators that don't understand that if I can't pay my rent and I need to get food to eat, I'm not accessing care because I need gas in my car to get to work and I need to eat. We don't
Right.
have legislators that know that. We don't have people in decisions understanding that. I talked to a legislator before and they were like, well, I never had to experience to know how much a milk costs at the store. And I'm like, okay, so you're not going to know. You're not going to know
Right.
these things, right? And so making it more interconnected conversations that it have accountability is really where work has to start. No more of having these informational conversations where I'm talking an HIV 101, because you can go get that on Google for free.
Right.
For
It's
free.
free.
For free. And there are so many campaigns right now of folks that are doing stuff that's going to provide you with educational purposes. Now I need to tell you what's going to happen after that.
I agree. I think that for me, that's where the work is. The work is reminding people that I'm not here to be your encyclopedia, your ABC 123 anymore. When it comes down to us as human beings, I am here to be your next step, right? I've done the work. I got the HIV 101 down to a point where I think I'm responsible to come to you now and sharpen my tool, right? And then if I realize that you need to bone up on some of that HIV 101, I am happy to track back with you just a little bit. But the idea that you still have folks that are coming to you saying like, I don't know that it can't be contracted through kissing, or I don't know that it can't be contracted if a person with HIV sweats on me. Like, we need to be so for real, right? Like, we really need to be so for real. And then also, I think that it's important and it's imperative that I think some of the work is reminding people that the things that you care about, you take the time to figure out. Half of y'all watched Risa Tisa for 52 something odd hours because you cared, right?
Okay.
And so if you can't take 10 minutes to read an article that is going to actually affect and impact your life and could, like Tony's been saying this entire interview, we are all, if you are not already living with HIV possible.
Mm-hmm.
Not all of us are going to have a legion, right? Not to that extent. Not
Yeah.
all of us are going to go through that situation, not to that extent. But we all have the possibility of contracting HIV
Yeah.
unless we've already gotten it. And the fact that some of y'all spent 52 hours watching the story of another woman, and some of you at the end of it said, can't be me, won't gonna be me, ain't gonna be me. But you can't spend 10 minutes to read an article because you feel like, oh, well, I got Sadie in my life. I got Tony in my life. I have a hope in my life. I'm just going to go to get that information.
Mm-hmm.
One, pay the lady. That's number one. Number two, if you're gonna do that, if you're gonna expect me to exert labor that you could find for free, pay me for it, because that means that you obviously find value in my ability to teach you that you don't find on Google that you could get for free. So since you are telling me that you find value in my work and the way that I can break it down for you, pay me for it. That's number one. But number two, don't insult me by saying, well, I know a little something when you're not able and available, to then turn around and be able to show me where you've been able to do the work for yourself. You know what I'm saying?
And I just wanted to add one little small point, Hope. In this conversation, I know a lot of times we focus on the sexual component, but I just want to also make mention of substance abuse, the sharing of needles. If you work in the medical field, I've known a few people who have contracted HIV via taking out needles to the trash or where they dispose them, and have been poked by a needle that has been used on a person living with HIV, and now they have HIV. So it's not always about who you're laying down with. It can simply be about if you're using drugs and sharing needles. And sometimes if you work in a medical space and boom, I've known somebody where it was done through dentistry. So it's like there's various ways of contracting HIV beyond just the sexual aspect. And I definitely think people should know that, because if y'all think it's about just laying with a certain community of people, oh girl, even if you want to think like that, okay, wonderful. However, there's other ways of contracting HIV beyond just who you're laying with. So I just want to add that
Absolutely.
small point too.
Absolutely. We have had a really great conversation, and I think that we've been able to like wrap up a couple of things for people to like sink their teeth into, and also galvanize and giving them, calls to action. Go and educate yourself, then come to us. Make sure you understand that there are multiple ways to get this. Understand that the ignorance around a particular community is not going to, like make you safe. Understanding that marriage is not a preventative measure. Understanding that, just because we are in Black spaces and in healthcare does not mean that we're always going to be seen as valuable Black people in those spaces. But I want to ask you both, what is something that you all like, what's the hill, right, that each of you would die on as it pertains to this topic? And specifically, if there's something that you want all Black women and femmes to be able to die on this hill with you, what is the one thing that you want the audience to take away?
Um,
I have too many hills. I got too many hills. I need to figure out which one I want to actually just dive on that hard.
I I think for me, I would say, and like you already mentioned what I've been saying, I feel like once people, and I'm gonna do a little remix, but once people realize that um even though they are not living with HIV, they are HIV possible, and they come into the realization that they have to hold themselves accountable for their sexual health, and beyond sexual health, just overall health, human health. But in relation to HIV, their sexual health, I think that's going to be something that's beautiful, because I also know that we talk about ending the epidemic by 2030. And so I think having people really internalize, allow themselves to know that they are a part of this conversation and a part of the demographics that HIV is impacting, and then holding themselves accountable to do the work for themselves and the communities or their villages around them, I think is and not only just that, but we see that reflected in the numbers as well.
I think, dang, you took my.
No.
I mean, that accountability is like huge to me.
You ate that for
I,
me.
yeah, it's that, yeah. Like, I think one that I think being uncomfortable is a hill that I just cannot get past, even more than the idea of being accountable, or to being accountable. I think being uncomfortability is what got me into this work. And I think being uncomfortable and not afraid of failure will continue to get me to stay in this work. But I also think that from being uncomfortable creates power. And I think that collective power is when a whole bunch of people realize that, like, this may not go the way that we want to, but we gonna try something, because doing something rather than nothing is gonna be happening, right? And so I think, like, being uncomfortable, and that comes with conversations, that's asking questions, that is, I feel like within our culture it's really not talked about asking questions. I've been in several different panel experiences and conversations where folks didn't ask questions, and one, because either they were afraid to ask questions because in their brain they're already kind of like programmed as that, like, maybe it's a dumb question, maybe it's not a good question, but just being afraid of like failure, to where if it doesn't go right, it doesn't. That's why that some things that we do in the community, whether it's campaigns or whether it's projects or any of that, we're such afraid of failure, of it not working, that we just don't do it. So we keep doing the same interventions, the same processes that we always done, because we know that those have been tested out, they're proven, and they work great. So I think not being afraid of failure, and I think being uncomfortable with whatever decision you make, I think that is going to be so important as Black women, as humans, as just folks, regardless if you do the work or not, being uncomfortable.
I love that. And with that being said, I want to thank you both again for coming and really engaging the audience with this conversation. But also, I want to take a little bit of time to shout out to the HIV Vaccine Trial Network for giving us space to be able to have conversations like this in ways that feel authentic to us. If you want to take a look at more of the things that HIV Vaccine Trial Network is doing, be sure to follow them over at Help End HIV via Instagram, or you want to head over to helpendhiv.org today. And with that being said, y'all, I'll see y'all next time, because who knows who I'm going to be having a conversation about HIV with next. Bye, everybody.